Hi everybody, welcome back. Again, this is our world history class, world history since 1500. So today we'll be getting started looking at some of the actual material we're going to be covering. Last time we were just kind of getting into the class and the requirements and books and stuff like that. This time we'll be getting down to some of the actual history. Specifically, we'll be talking about Europeans and Africans crossing the Atlantic Ocean and the forming of some new kind of world where both hemispheres are together, something that hadn't happened in, hundreds of thousands of years. So what led to these sort of early encounters between Europeans, Africans, South Asians, people in China, people in the Americas? There was a bunch of stuff going on around the same time that led towards all these sort of explorations and all this sort of crossover that's going to really create a new world. So first we'll look at what the world was like around 1450, 1500, what was going on, what sort of political units there were, where they're located, things like that. Then we'll take a look at the sort of growing technology, particularly the sort of oceanic technology that led towards exploration and why people were doing that. And then we'll look at some of the early encounters, why people were doing this stuff, and what happened. So the world around 1450 was full of a lot of complex societies that were mostly big farming empires. What is an empire, you might ask? Here's a nice little map that shows some of those around 1450. Empires tend to have a large geographic extent. That is, they cover a lot of land. So like a little teeny place, a village or something can't really be an empire. That doesn't make any sense. But lots of cities, lots of villages together under sort of one umbrella can be an empire. Empires tend to have a small ruling elite that doesn't necessarily have to be the same as the rest of the population. They might be different religiously, they might be different racially, they might be different certainly in terms of status. But none of that really matters. There's people on the top that for whatever reason have managed to sort of take over and expand. So sort of by definition, they're going to be including lots of other people here and there that are different than them. Empires tend to have that sort of shape to them, that sort of feel culturally and ethnically. Also, empires have really complex economies that are primarily driven by agriculture. Obviously, in cities, you're going to have lots of other stuff. You're going to have shops, you're going to have all kinds of far regional exchange, goldsmiths, all kinds of stuff like that you've seen, I'm sure, in old-time movies or other texts or whatever, stuff like that. But typically, they all are driven by farming. In China, it's going to be rice. In Europe, it's going to be wheat or beets or eventually potatoes. The Incan Empire, right, is where all the potatoes are going to come from. You'll see that in a couple times. And empires tend to be really diverse. So we think now of nation states having sort of one particular identity. I don't know, Americans love freedom and hot dogs and trucks and stuff. Canadians are all supposed to love hockey, I don't know, whatever, stuff like that. But you can't really do that with empires because as empires expand, they take over other places. And when you bring new people into the fold, you're always sort of expanding what it means to be part of that empire. So you have a lot more diversity than you do actually today in a modern nation state. And we'll sort of see what that looks like later. So some of these you may have heard of, these really large scale empires. Others you can kind of get a sense of where they are. Around this time we'll be cutting in. The Ming Dynasty is in control in China. Here on this map you have the sort of modern outline of China today. And this is the sort of extent of the Ming Dynasty at its fullest. So it's not quite exactly the same. You'll notice lots of sort of area there to the northeast and what's now like the areas around North Korea and stuff like that. The Ming Dynasty was not the biggest Chinese dynasty, but it still covers this incredible amount of land. If you've seen that in any of the previous history classes or something. Over on the other side of Eurasia, right? It's just a fancy word I'll use to mean sort of like from Europe over to Asia. Around this time, you had what were called Islamic empires or gunpowder empires. There's different ways historians refer to them. Either one is kind of tricky. They weren't all Islamic. Certainly lots of people lived in these empires that weren't Muslim, but typically they're called that because the leadership was. Anyway, another term people give them sometimes is gunpowder empires, which we'll see a little bit more of that coming up because they were some of the early adapters of firearm technology. So some places like Egypt, you see the sort of large expanse that the Ottoman Empire created. The Ottoman Empire originally is kind of spinning out of this area, managing to take over a big section of North Africa and down into the Arab Peninsula. So you see a lot of stuff there. Oop, I guess I can't make that go away. Okay, got it to go away. So there we go. So here's the Ottoman Empire in its sort of early years of expanding. And you can see it's kind of seated up here around the top of the Mediterranean Black Sea in what today is Turkey. And it's going to last a really long time. If you look at these dates, the Ottoman Empire is going to be around until the 20th century. So these empires are really large, they're really long running, they're not necessarily going anywhere, and we'll see them again coming up. Over in the Americas, you have kind of a different situation. The Aztec Empire is where we would say is like southern Mexico today. There had been an empire there, but it wasn't very long existing, and we're going to see why that is. Basically, right around the time that Europeans and Africans show up to the Americas, there's conflict in the Aztec Empire. It's just sort of forming, and Europeans in particular are going to interrupt that process, and the Aztec Empire is not going to last for so long. But it covers a giant section of the Americas. Also, the Incan Empire, right? This one's a little bit funky looking, as you can kind of tell. Over here, it runs kind of down the length of a continent, rather than necessarily being expansive over land like this. The Incan Empire is kind of funky. It's expansive, like from the ocean up into the mountains. And that's kind of different. Instead of thinking about it covering lots and lots of land, you can think of it covering lots and lots of elevation, which is pretty different. But again, you'll see the time on this, right? The Incan Empire is only not even around quite 100 years. And again, we're going to see it gets interrupted by Europeans pretty quickly after forming into a sort of cohesive unit. So we'll get a sense there of what's happening in the next couple classes too. It's not just the Americas and Europe and Asia. Lots of people leave out these large African empires, but as we're going to see, there's all kinds of stuff there. There's one of the oldest kingdoms in the world is going to be going on in Africa during this period. The Songhai Empire covers this huge expanse of West Africa. This region's absolutely enormous. This was a fantastically large empire. It was built on top of two previous empires, Mali and Ghana. So it's just an incredibly complex state. But you'll see also it doesn't last a tremendously long time. We're going to figure out what happens there. It has to do again with Europeans and the sort of growing transatlantic slave trade, but also the introduction of guns and sort of infighting in that region. So we'll get a sense of what's going on. With all of these empires, the point is not like, oh, you should know about the Songhai or the Ming or something like that. I just want to give you a sense of what was out there. What did the world kind of look like before 1500 in terms of the really big polities? Since we're going to talk about Europe kind of an awful lot, here's a little map of it. But what you might see is there's not really one big empire like the Songhai Empire or Ming Dynasty China. There's lots of little states. Yeah, the Holy Roman Empire is kind of big right there in the middle, but you got to be careful because it was never really solid like that. There was all kinds of stuff going on. As you can see from all those little names inside the empire, there were lots of little principalities and kingdoms and all kinds of other stuff. But all of these empires do have certain commonalities in the early modern period. And it sort of helps to understand them because then as we move towards these sort of later empires, and as we move towards nation states, you can get a sense of what it's sort of moving away from or how it's changing. So primarily, most of these empires in 1450, 1500 were overland. That is to say, a little kingdom starts, it expands, it expands, it expands, and before you know it, you have an empire. That's really different from what we're going to see. We're going to see there's a little kingdom here, and they send boats over here, and then they start an empire over here, right? Really kind of separate from each other. But at first, these are primarily all going to be overland. Empires are all based on expansion. There's a lot of talk about that, sort of things have to grow or they have to die. And the whole point of an empire was to continue to expand to get new resources, new tax base, new people. Empires are not sort of satisfied powers. They want to continuously grow. Also, all of these economies were based on the sort of taxation of agricultural products, right? Like I sort of said a minute ago, you got rice, you got wheat, potatoes, corn in the Americas. And that's the driving economic engine. That's how you pay for soldiers, that's how you pay for expansion, all these sorts of things. But there was a sort of growing concern with long distance trade. So we talked about a little bit last lecture that part of the modern world is increasing globalization, and this idea that things and ideas move all over the world and part of these broader economies. We're going to see that happen with these empires. They're all going to want stuff that's exotic from really far away. They're all going to want more resources. Well, where are we going to get those, right? You might have to go to another continent. You might have to cross an ocean, something like this. So you see a lot more competition for that. That's going to drive some of the things we'll be looking at today, and then obviously in the transatlantic slave trade and such. Another thing that's kind of funky about this early modern world is where people are is tremendously imbalanced. So half of the world has the Americas in it, and the other half has Eurasia and Australia and Africa in it. The half of the world with Eurasia and Africa and Australia has the vast majority of the people. So 85, maybe 90% of the world's population lives in Afro-Eurasia. That's incredibly misbalanced. In the Americas, which is the other half of the hemisphere, only about 10 to 15% of the population lives there. And there's various reasons for this, for why the population is so much bigger in Afro-Eurasia, more domestication of animals, these sorts of things. But that's really from the first world history class. You don't have to worry too much about it. It's just sort of a thing to keep in mind because it does matter in terms of how the Americas are going to respond to threats from Europe in particular. So we'll get a sense of more of that as well. Okay, so what about these explorations? If you've read the chapter, you read about all the sort of main characters of exploration, Vasco da Gama and Columbus and stuff like this, and I'll talk about some of them in particular. But why was there this new sort of trend, particularly for Europeans, to go and check out what was happening in the Atlantic, or check out what was happening in West Africa, or try to get to Asia? What was enabling these sorts of things? It was kind of a philosophical, kind of based on technology, kind of based on the need for different resources. We'll sort of see how that works. So it's not like, oh, in 1492, Europeans just hit the road or something. There had been a lot of long-range interregional travel across the oceans done by all kinds of different people, and actually Europeans were kind of late to the game. So you might point out like Zheng He, it's kind of spelled a little bit differently than you might think, was a Chinese sailor, admiral, who was responsible for these giant missions. The Chinese government sent out these huge ships to go check out what was going on around the world, which to them meant the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, maybe a little bit of the Pacific. These ships were absolutely huge. Over in this illustration, you see two different ships. This small ship here is the ship Columbus used. By comparison, this is the ship that Zheng He was on. These ships were absolutely massive. They just made European ships look very, very small. You could load all kinds of stuff onto this. They farmed on top of these. Zheng He, at this time, he's making these trips, actually gets all the way over to East Africa, where he picks up a giraffe, and this poor little giraffe gets put on the ship and gets sent all the way back to Beijing, where his bones are still on display in a museum, actually. But he lives apparently very happily there for a little while. Just an example of these like really far-reaching voyages the Chinese were going on in the 15th century. But they're not the only ones. Here you go. Here's the trip they actually took. Right, so you see Zheng He was originally from southern China, kind of down in this area here. But all of these red lines represent places where he went with these massive sort of treasure ships that they were called, so making it all the way over into Southwest Asia, even over here into East Africa. Really cool stuff, way kind of ahead of other sort of giant oceanic voyages. But ultimately, the Ming government is going to put an end to these voyages and sort of just decide they don't have the money for it and they're not so concerned with what's out there necessarily anyway. Other people, like the Vikings, coming out of Scandinavia over here, right? So this is like Norway, Sweden, that area, right? Denmark, had traveled over by 1,000 maybe, over to Iceland, over to Greenland. Here's Iceland, here's Greenland, and over into Canada and possibly even New England. This is really well documented. There's a great sort of Viking saga about going over to these new lands in this strange world. There's even talk about how they met Native Americans, essentially, stuff like this. It's really funky, really well documented. Another giant oceanic exploration human beings have been undertaking for thousands of years was the slow movement of people across the Pacific. So Polynesians had been moving kind of down this way for a long time, and they had gotten way out into the Pacific here and started to branch out into places like Hawaii, gone back to New Zealand, actually, is kind of the latest voyages for them, and made it over here to Easter Island, what we call it now, Rapa Nui, right, Easter Island now, and from there had actually even gone to the Americas. There's some great evidence based on plants and statuary that essentially Polynesians had made it to South America and then gone back into the Pacific Oceans. Some really cool stuff there that maybe you've seen before if you've seen from other history classes or something. Pretty awesome stuff. So it's not like nobody had done these sorts of things before. It's not like Europeans like invented something brand new in terms of hitting the oceans. But the way they did it and where they were going was new and had some new sort of drivers encouraging them to do that. So around 1450, there's a lot of changes that's going to motivate Europeans to start exploring the world's oceans. One of those drivers is the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. So this is one of those ones that's going to be called an Islamic empire, right, or a gunpowder empire in the future. They start to control a broad area here around the Mediterranean. In particular, they block off this area of the Red Sea. So up here, I'll switch colors for you. Up here you got these Europeans, right? And they're just starting to get a taste from things from India, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, but even here from Egypt, right? Sugar's been coming through. But all these things are trying to get up through the Red Sea this way to Europe, right? Europeans, that's how they've made that connection. But as it turns out, with the Ottoman Empire expanding, Europeans can no longer necessarily get that stuff as easily, particularly in sort of Northern Europe and Western Europe. So one of the reasons that Europeans are going to start sort of going out into the ocean is to get around this, instead of trying to go through the Ottoman Empire or deal with them or pay other taxes or something like this, these Europeans are going to try and go like out and around Africa. The idea being maybe they could go all the way around Africa to get to Asia somehow. They weren't quite sure. Also, there was a lot of instability in Europe. As we're going to see next time, lots and lots of changes were happening in Europe, politically, religiously, scientific advancements, all kinds of new ideologies, particularly in places like Spain and Portugal that had been under the rule of Islamic leadership. When that pulls back into North Africa and the Spanish and the Portuguese reconquer, as they call it, the Iberian Peninsula, there's going to be a push to kind of keep going. Another factor that we're going to see is Europe's recovering from the plague or the Black Death. Remember, there's no Black Plague. That's kind of a misnomer, but Black Death is good, or plague, either one is fine. But Europe lost lots and lots of people, right? Maybe in some places half their population, other places more mild, 15 or 20% of the population. If you can call that mild, that's horrifyingly large. But the sort of death toll transformed society. Lots of Europeans had new sort of outlooks on life. They had new desires to go places, stuff like this. And this was tied into the Renaissance. The Renaissance would have happened with or without the plague, probably, right? Most historians argue. But it was sort of one of the pushers in that direction. And the Renaissance, I'm sure you guys have heard about this before. It's this sort of flowering of new intellectual movements, new philosophical movements, religious movements, artistic movements in Europe. And it is going to be tied as well with exploration, this idea that the world is knowable and that we should know about it. Another thing we see a lot, oh, here you go, here's some Renaissance. I found like the weirdest Renaissance painting possible for you guys for some reason. Another thing is there's just simply changing tastes in Europe. So when you look at this painting, you get a sense of what Europeans were hip to at the time. I don't know, it's pretty wild. They got like a little dog down here. This guy's got a big kind of fur hat up here, right? They're wearing lots of fur. They got these fancy wooden shoes. They got these metal items and mirrors. All of this stuff is coming from other places. It's coming from the Arab world, it's coming from India, it's coming from Southeast Asia, it's coming from Russia. So you have a lot of different stuff going on in terms of what people like, what people want to buy, what they're using on a daily basis. And just like in any economy or any culture, you have to get those things, right? If something is in fashion, people want it. And if the only way you can get it is to like go somewhere and get it, people will do that. Finally, there's a lot of new technology that was coming in from India and Asia, in particular maritime technology, new sails, ideas about the compass, things like this that allowed for the sort of basic technical function that Europeans would need to increase their sort of exploratory abilities. Also, there's a wide sort of growing trade network system that's happening at this time. So here you see like the old sort of Silk Roads, right? Kind of coming. I'm sure you guys have heard about this. It's like in every high school, you have to do it. This is just that old transition where you go from East Asia all the way over to Europe. All across there were trading routes, there were networks of trade, there were whole communities set up that made one particular product along these routes or that transported in one particular product. And the idea was that was like the main way you got things around. There were, of course, all kinds of oceanic routes, both to the sort of Silk Road or just totally independently at the time as well. But this sort of old way of trade is going to slowly reduce because as shipping technology gets better, you're going to be able to use more and more ships. It doesn't make sense to take something overland this way if you can put it on a ship right here and go around this way. So people start to get more and more invested in maritime technology, and it changes what you can trade. For example, you don't really want to trade a lot in something that's really heavy and not super duper valuable. Let's say my game is trading salt. Well, salt's pretty heavy, and it might be really necessary, but you don't want to take it really, really long distances because you're going to have to load it on camels, you're going to have to load it on horses, it's going to move really slow. But what if gold is my game? Yeah, gold is still really heavy, but you can move just a little bit of it and it's still really valuable. So a lot of the old trade routes were about moving lighter commodities or commodities that you didn't have to move in as much bulk to make a lot of money. Once you have ships, though, you can load a ship full of wood or salt or whatever you want, and it still floats. You can still move it, so you can make a lot more profit off of these things that would be less reasonable to move over land. The plague that we talked about didn't just affect Europe. It affects all of Afro-Eurasia in one way or another, and those were kind of changing. Also, up here, you formerly had this Mongol Empire that you guys might know about, you know, Genghis Khan and all that sort of stuff. And they had, even though they're depicted as like bloodthirsty, you know, horse riding archers and stuff, that's true. But they also cared deeply about trade, and they had managed these sort of trading regions across Afro-Eurasia. But when those trading regions start to disappear because there's not Mongols anymore, something else is going to try to take its place. China, here, let me pick a different color for you. China over here, right? This sort of broader Chinese cultural sphere that includes parts of Southeast Asia, includes Japan, Korea, represents the biggest sort of section of the world economy. And everybody wanted their products, right? So we're talking porcelain, stuff like that. So how do you get that over here? Well, it became much easier just to take it by ship, right? So we'll sort of see how that plays out and what people start doing to get in on these markets. But China is going to do something kind of weird during this time. Hold on a second, let me delete this for you. During during this time, China is going to sort of stop exporting a lot of its main products. So they're not really so concerned about global trade anymore. The voyages by Zheng He went all over, they explored, they traded stuff, and to the Chinese leadership, they became sort of more suspicious of outsiders. They became convinced they had all the best stuff anyway, and so you wouldn't really need to trade with foreigners. But there was still a ton of money to be made. Chinese products were still floating around all over here, down in Southeast Asia, and Europeans, Africans, and people over here in Southwest Asia all still wanted this stuff. So they're going to try and get in on it through this maritime trade. But what did Europeans and North Africans and stuff have to offer? Well, as it turns out, there's going to be gold and silver, and we're going to see that that's what's going to be the most popular in China in the future. China is definitely willing to take silver off of Europeans or anyone else who comes their way. Europeans are going to try to get in on the sort of trade in Southeast Asia. We'll see how that all works in the next couple lessons. Here you go. This is actually over here, right, is the Mediterranean. This is the Strait of Gibraltar. So up here is Spain and Portugal, and down here is West Africa. There's going to be a sort of new relationship between these places. There's going to be a lot of trade between the sort of Mediterranean North, which is considered European, Italian, Spain, Portugal, and Mediterranean South, which is going to be North Africa and these sort of empires that are connecting to the Islamic world and connecting to West Africa and the gold that's there. And we'll see this is kind of set up some of the slave trade in a little way. So one European in particular was really pushing the advancement of Europeans sort of into the ocean at this time, right in that same area, the Strait of Gibraltar, Spain, Portugal, West Africa. Prince Henry, he's often called Henry the Navigator. There's his dates and stuff like that. So he's Portuguese nobility. He had fought in the Reconquest. He had fought to get the Islamic folks out of the Iberian Peninsula and had worked to sort of reestablish the Portuguese monarchy. In fact, he had fought against the Muslims all the way in Morocco, had pushed, back into North Africa, and he became convinced that the future was oceans. As it turns out, the Spanish and Portuguese were just starting to discover that off the coast of Europe and Africa here, there were a bunch of islands, the Azores, the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, and that these islands would be a great sort of launching off point to West Africa or to explore the world's oceans. And Prince Henry is going to open a school for exactly that. The idea is, how do we get around all of our enemies, all of these Muslims we've been fighting for quite a while to sort of kick them out of Europe? How do we get around the Ottoman Empire? We don't want to have to deal with them. We don't want to have to trade with them. And the idea was, if our ships are good enough, we can just go all the way around, right? We'll be able to just drop down, from here, just right down the coast, and if this is where the gold and stuff is coming from, cool. If it's somewhere further in Asia, we'll be able to do that too. So they weren't really sure, but they knew that they wanted to get around the Moroccans, get around the other Islamic empires. To do this, they were going to bring in a bunch of new maritime technology from Asia, ideas about compasses, ideas about sails, ship construction, things like that. Also, they had a bunch of new maps and star charts from the Arab world that they had reconquered in Spain, or from Chinese sources, Indian sources, stuff like that. And they start to figure out something really interesting. As it turns out in the world's oceans, they're not just sitting still and you don't just take your boat through them. They're moving around with these currents, and the currents sort of spiral in very predictable directions. For example, north of the equator here, the currents always sort of spiraled this way. And south of the equator here, the currents always sort of spiraled this way. And this can be really, really useful in terms of navigating your boat, keeping things on track. If you try to just go right down the coast of West Africa here, and then turn and continue down the coast here in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to be in big trouble. It's not actually going to work. Around the time you get right here, the currents are going to start always moving against you. So if you try to do that, you're just going to crash into that. It's going to be very hard, slow going, really inefficient. But if you take an alternative and you kind of go this way, you let the currents pull you, you let these currents pull you, and then here you actually turn out away from Africa, the currents will move your ship out, and then they'll take you right back down towards southern Africa. And then if you want, you can go up the coast. The same for going home, right? Instead of trying to go this way, it won't work. Let those currents kind of take you back around, right? So this is the return by sea, the Volta do Mar, right? That the Portuguese are starting to figure out that you can ride these currents, right, to outmaneuver that Islamic trade, to get to what you want in Asia, spices, gold, all these sort of new things, sugar that you're really excited about. Also, there was a sort of missionary element to it. Sometimes these are described as like looking for gold and God, right? That the Portuguese were out to convert people and to make money. And both of those are true, and we'll see some of that when we look at the Americas in particular later. But these initial efforts were not too successful. The Portuguese and Henry's school, they're going to find some cool new stuff. They're going to start to understand the oceans a little bit better, but it's still going to be a little while before Europeans really get out into those oceans and really start getting around the world in the same way that other people already had been for a while. So the big story in some ways is the way the technology is changing. So at Henry's school, this is true, but also sort of around Europe, there's just more and more um, technology coming in from Asia, places like the Indian Ocean in particular, that had a huge maritime trade for hundreds of years before this. The Iberian region, that is Spain and Portugal, become really interested in maritime innovation. They're going to borrow from everybody they can. Spain was under the rule of Muslim Empire. There was a lot of exchange with Arabs, Jewish scholars, other Europeans. And if you're going to start exploring the oceans, one of the first things you might do is figure out what's out there. So naturally, they start looking for maps, they start looking for star charts, they start looking for charters, navigational tools, all this sort of stuff. And that makes a big difference in their knowledge of the oceans that's going to allow them to move around safely. Also, they start to develop new types of ships. For example, the caravel here, it's not too big, it's not super duper fast, but it is really movable. It can fight pretty well because it can kind of outmaneuver some of its enemies and stuff like that. It's built to take cargo around relatively calm water, the Mediterranean, right off the coast of the Iberian Peninsula and stuff like that. Then they're going to build the Carrack, which is an even bigger boat. This is an ocean-going boat. If you've seen like Pirates of the Caribbean or any of those type of movies, this is usually the sort of boat you would see. They're really large. They have a really big bottom. They can store lots and lots of stuff. And you'll notice something new on these. You've got a lot of cannons here. So as you're exploring the world, as it turns out, if you're Europeans, you might be worried about people being hostile to you, or you might be thinking about why you might want weapons to encourage trade later, right? So those cannons are going to be used for defense sometimes, but they're also often going to be used to encourage trade because you point them at a city and say, oh, hey, trade with me so I don't shoot you. So that's coming for sure. And we'll see that's pretty effective. These ships are only going to get better and better in terms of technology, but these really large ocean-going vessels are going to make it worthwhile to do anyway. There's no particular point in traveling all around the world for trade if your ship's not big enough to bring stuff home, right? So some of these early European explorers you've probably heard of. They definitely talk about them in the book. Vasco da Gama is one, right? He's sort of famously credited with being the first European to make it to India. It's, unclear if that's true, but it's pretty clear that he is the first to do this sort of oceanic route using these new Portuguese technologies. Why does he do this? He's looking for spices. When you think of Indian food or Southeast Asian food, you might think of lots of different spices. And this was true for Europeans too. There was like pepper and nutmeg, stuff like this that, you just couldn't grow in Europe, but it grows all over Southeast Asia, all over India. And so Europeans really wanted that stuff. These things are really good, not just for giving food more flavor, but also preserving food, right? Things like that. And they had become very much in fashion in Europe. So if you wanted to be fashionable in Europe, you had to have this stuff, right? That's why you have the trade. So Vasco da Gama, pretty cool, interesting little route here. He's going to go out from Portugal, drop down the coast using these currents, right? Like we talked about. He's going to swing out here. He actually gets really, really close to Brazil, what today is Brazil. He didn't know that. Then the currents sweep him back around to southern Africa. Here things get a little tricky for him, though. No European charts were available. No Europeans had been here by this point, so they didn't really know what they were doing. So they stop off on the coast, and lo and behold, there's people there. So they find local traders, other boatsmen, that know where they're going. And they tell these people, hey, look, we want to go, over here somewhere. And these people say, oh, yeah, we know about that, right? So Vasco da Gama picks up some locals who are ship captains, navigators, stuff like that. And with these people's help, he manages to get around here. It's kind of a bumpy ride. They don't know what they're doing. They make it over here to a large trading hub in East Africa that's connected to these Indian Ocean trades. In East Africa, there were cities that were connected to India, to Southeast Asia, all these big trade relationships. And here again, they're able to pick up new people that have new information about the Indian Ocean trade. Vasco da Gama is really excited to get over to India where this stuff is happening. The people tell him, hey man, it's not really a good time to go. The winds will be against us for a little bit. No big deal. They make it over safely. They're here in India for a while. As it turns out, the Indians don't really want most things Europeans have. Vasco da Gama, he's trying to bring furniture, furs, stuff like that. I don't know if you know about India, it's pretty hot. They don't really want any furs. They don't much care for the furniture. But Vasco da Gama brings one thing the Indians want, and that's gold. So in exchange for gold, he's able to load up on spices, and he goes to head home. His journey home is pretty rough. As it turns out, just like there are these systems over here of currents, in the Indian Ocean, the currents change depending on the season, right? The monsoon. He leaves at the wrong time because he just doesn't have knowledge. So when you see this sort of pattern back to East Africa, it's because they didn't really know what they were doing. It just took a lot longer. He makes it back around. He rides this current up the coast of East Africa, kicks out, lets the currents bring him back to Portugal. When he gets back, it's sort of a huge accomplishment. He's able to set up a sort of semi-permanent European exchange between India and Portugal. And this enables Europe for the first time to really cut around these Islamic traders, even a lot of Arab and Indian traders, right? Europeans are going to go and set up their own sort of ports just for trading on their own, which was something really new. Another sort of famous voyage early on for some of these Europeans is Ferdinand Magellan going around the world. He's credited for being the first person to go all the way around the world. It's kind of true, it's kind of not, again. So he's coming a little bit later, right? A lot of his voyages are happening, 20 or 30 years after Vasco da Gama. And he's building on top of information. So as Europeans go a little further, as they get to India, then they know more. As they find the Americas, then they know more, right? You'll also notice this is after 1492, right? So after Columbus has discovered there are places in the Americas and things like that. So Magellan is credited with going around the world. Here you go. He kicks off out of the Iberian Peninsula. He rides these currents down. Lo and behold, he hits land over here. Slowly, he gets around to the Philippines. Now, when he gets to the Philippines, there's sort of a problem. There's two different competing factions in the Philippines vying for power, and he decides to try to play them off of each other with the hopes of getting like some good stuff for Spain. He's looking for spices and gold and stuff. As it turns out, though, he's trying to play these Filipinos off each other. They get wise to what's happening and they murder him. So he dies there in the Philippines. He's still credited with going all the way around the world, though, because his ship gets back into these sort of Indian Ocean that Europeans know about. They cut back over to southern Africa, where they had already kind of figured out, right, from Da Gama, and are able to get home. Because in his earlier voyages, Ferdinand Magellan had been to these areas, most people then attributed to him as the first European to go all the way around. As it turns out, though, he didn't do it all at once, because when he was in the Philippines, he got killed for trying to mess with the Filipinos, which at the time he just probably shouldn't have done. However, the Spanish are going to use that as a stepping stone to establishing a colony in the Philippines, right? And the Philippines are going to become a Spanish colony for quite a long time. As you can see really quickly, Europeans are just all over these oceans. This time period is about 200 years. This is straight from the book. And this shows all of the various routes Europeans are taking. They're all over the Atlantic, they're all over the South Pacific, they're all over the Indian Ocean, up into the Arctic Oceans. It's really a big sort of heyday for European exploration and trying to just discover where everything is at. This isn't even showing Columbus's voyages and all that sort of stuff. So pretty quickly, Europeans are just everywhere in terms of that's possible to go sort of through maritime adventuring. This was, all sort of part of the same impulse. There's a lot of competition going on. Once the Portuguese get around Africa, the Spanish want to get around Africa. Then we're going to see later the Dutch, the English, the French, everybody else is going to get in on these sorts of things and try to discover new stuff for themselves and sort of for access to trade or to material gain or for colonization, all kinds of stuff like this. These explorations that begin early on are going to lead to a lot of opportunities for Europeans and a lot of weird interactions that aren't as straightforward as you might think. Often, either you've heard the story of like Europeans discover the Americas, right? We know there's problems with that. Or you hear the stories of like Europeans just showing up and killing everybody, right? Neither of those are necessarily true. There's a lot of different interactions that happen that nobody's really expecting. Also, you'll notice that often in those narratives, Africans and Asians are just completely left out. That's really problematic because they were there for sure. So the earliest encounters that Europeans have in all of this sort of ocean-going stuff is with West Africa. So the whole idea behind Portuguese and Spanish exploration, right, was to get around some of these Islamic kingdoms to get further down to where they thought the gold was coming from, or to where they could get around these Islamic groups to get into Asia to where they thought the spices were coming from, stuff like this. So there's a lot of early interactions between Europeans and North Africans. As Europeans get further and further south here, they're going to start interacting with West Africans, and to their surprise, West Africans are actually well organized, they have large kingdoms, they have lots of resources, and the relationship between West Africans and Europeans is actually pretty complex. Here you can see the sort of Portuguese routes into West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa and some of their sort of main stops early on. And you're going to see there's actually kind of a lot of kingdoms here that the Portuguese interact with, and it's not really straightforward. Also, it's not the same everywhere. So it's a mistake to sort of say like, oh, Europeans were like this and Africans were like that. There's actually different reactions. So remember, these early Portuguese are looking for gold, they're looking for spices, maybe they're looking to do some missionary work and converting people. But at least at this point, they weren't really dominant militarily. Some would have guns, they definitely had access to a lot of horses and iron and stuff like this, but so did West Africans. So in the stories you might see, or in media you might have seen, West Africans are like unorganized or whatever. That's not true. They actually had really large empires. They actually already had a system of slavery. And what happens is the Portuguese are going to sort of fill a new role for West Africans in the culture they already have. So in particular, here we are. This is sort of like the first section. You can see like right here, right, the sort of Horn of Africa, and then next time we'll look at this sort of section here, where we're kind of talking. So one of the places the Portuguese first arrive is the Kingdom of Benin, right here. So this area is part of a large sort of grouping of people. After the Songhai Empire in particular is sort of losing power, there's lots of little sort of pushes for other regional powers, local kingdoms, stuff like that. The Kingdom of Benin is largely involved with slavery and gold. And famously, their slavery system works differently. We'll talk about this more when we get to the ideas about transatlantic slavery. But when the Portuguese show up, they're really interested in that gold. They're really interested in what Africans have to offer, but they don't necessarily have a lot to offer. So instead of offering something to the Africans in terms of material, they're going to turn to the people in Benin and say, we can take over this sort of carrying trade for you. And what this means was the Kingdom of Benin had a system of slavery where you could buy and sell slaves for different reasons. And we'll get to this later, it's pretty different. So what the Portuguese did is they said, look, let us transport these slaves for you. So we'll take them from one place to another and we'll charge you a little bit of gold for that. That's how the Portuguese are going to sort of make money initially off the sort of slave trade. Initially, the Portuguese are going to West Africa for gold, and they're hoping for spices and sugar and stuff like that, but mostly it's gold. The situation is really well managed by the king in Benin. These are masks that are worn by the leadership in Benin, right? And what you do is you depict around the top of the head different spirit animals, different things you're in control of that sort of show your greatness. In this particular mask, these are all Europeans up here, right? These are supposed to be like these Portuguese traders. So this particular Benin person had a mask that sort of showed all these Portuguese traders like on his head, right? Like he's in control of them. Pretty wild. Definitely not maybe the relationship you might think of. But in other places, the relationship between the Portuguese and Africans is going to work totally differently. So for example, in Congo, which is a little bit further down, like starting to be in that sort of sub-Saharan region, the Portuguese are much more influential and quickly come to sort of dominate the kingdom. So whereas in Benin, there's this well-organized system of trade and the Portuguese have to sort of work within it, in the Kingdom of Congo, as we're going to see, there's some problems already, and the Portuguese are going to kind of get involved in those problems and really mess things up. So here you go. One of the ways they do that is by bringing religion. And at this particular time, there was already sort of civil conflict among different groups in Congo, and religion's going to become a focal point of that. Here you go. We're going to see this is the leader in Congo. He's actually going to change his name. He's going to take a Christian name. He's going to become a Christian. And here are the Portuguese coming to talk to him, and we're going to talk about why these sorts of things are set up this way. It's pretty funky. But this is not the way it was everywhere, as I tried a second ago. In places like Benin, it's totally different. We'll see more of that. All right, I guess we got to do Christopher Columbus. Everybody wants to talk about him. He's sort of the big name, and he's conspicuously absent so far. He is going to cause the sort of biggest stir in these early interactions. So Columbus was Genoese, probably. There's some debate on these things. Some people argue he was Portuguese and stuff like that. Doesn't particularly matter. He was hired by the Spanish government to go looking for a Western Passage, that is, a way to just sail west and eventually run into Asia. So his idea was, the world was round, of course. Nobody thought the world was flat. That's garbage. I know some people today on Twitter do, but for the most part, Europeans, Arabs, the ancient Greeks, the Chinese, they all knew the world was round. They could calculate it very easily and stuff like that, but they didn't know the size. And so Columbus thought the world was much smaller, that basically you would just be able to sail out west, and eventually you would just run into Asia somewhere. And that was his whole idea. He gets sponsorship from the Spanish government to go for it, and he does, except when he gets where he's going, he doesn't know where he is. He lands somewhere in the Bahamas. it's really kind of he calls the people that he runs into Indians because he thinks maybe he's in India. Okay, that name kind of stuck, I guess. The people that he first meets are called Taino people. Maybe these people are from an area we might call like Puerto Rico today. Maybe they're from Cuba. It's unclear. These are the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands and maybe a section of the northern part of South America. Um, he meets these people. They seem really interesting. They seem totally bizarre to him. Some of their language is still around. If you've ever heard the word like hurricane or barbecue or hammock, those are all Taino words, right? Those were from the original people of the Caribbean that kind of worked their way into the English language eventually. But these people more or less are now gone. Not only do they die quickly from disease, but Columbus and his crew are not nice to these people, nor are the Europeans that are going to come very quickly over the next few years. We'll see kind of what happens to them when worlds collide in the next couple lectures. Columbus is going to take a number of trips. Here you go. Here's the actual Taino people, or at least a European representation of them later on. So Columbus is going to take 4 trips, essentially, back and forth between Spain and the Americas. So what's important to point out here is Columbus never went to America, at least not the United States. I don't know about you guys. Growing up, I was definitely like, oh, Columbus discovered the United States or something. That's not true. The early United States needed heroes, and we didn't really have any yet, and we picked Columbus as one of them. But no, Columbus indeed never made it into the United States. Mostly he's going to be around here in the Caribbean islands, and then one of his trips brings him pretty close to Mexico on the top of South America. But anyway, he goes back and forth between the Caribbean and Spain. Each time he's kind of trying to find more and more about his new sort of discovery of Asia, and he's convinced that he's like on the backside of China or India somewhere. After a few years, he starts to figure out that's not true, as do all the other European explorers. But each trip, he becomes more and more famous. He writes books, he goes on speaking tours. When he comes back after the first trip, he brings native peoples from the Caribbean with him, and they go on tour across Europe. He's just this famous self-promoter who continuously talks about how amazing he is and all this cool stuff. And it really propels him towards fame in Europe and launches lots of other Europeans to attempt their own explorations of the Caribbean and North America, South America, stuff like this. But it causes a lot of problems in the minds of Europeans themselves. So this new world they've discovered, which we're going to get to next time. Obviously, discovery is a really sort of fraught problem. I don't know how you discover a place that already has 80 or 100 million people in it or whatever, but we'll get to that. For Europeans and West Africans, though, this was wild. They had no idea that there was another half of the world out there. So Columbus, he wasn't the first to do these things, as we've seen, but he had really good timing. In terms of the world was just changing. He was the first one out of Europe to the Caribbean and back. It was right when there was all kinds of new printing, new ideas in Europe. Ideas could spread quickly, and it really kicked off this sort of revolution for Europeans understanding that there was a whole nother world out there. It's basically the same as if I were to say, yeah, we just figured out that this whole time there's been people living on the moon. From the European perspective, they really thought they understood what the world was like, what was out there. All of a sudden, there's a whole new world to them that they don't understand. The people are different, the language are different, the food is different, the environment's different. Europeans were just really confused. Some of them were confused because they were deeply invested in biblical explanations for how the world was made and what was out there. And a lot of stuff that was in the New World for them, that was in the Americas, they couldn't necessarily explain using the Bible. So that was tricky. Also, Europeans had this growing sense that they were sort of masters of this new technology and maritime travel. How could they have been so wrong, right? That there were these two giant continents out there that they didn't know about. So it kind of caused a lot of confusion. Also, this was a time when sort of colonization is starting. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, they're all going to be claiming different territories in the future. And there was an early sort of attempt to sort of rationalize the world. How do we know whose territory is whose? So one of the initial attempts was done by the Pope and the Spanish and Portuguese kind of getting together. And there's this document signed, the Treaty of Tordesillas, where essentially the Pope and the Spanish and Portuguese all get together and they say, okay, this half of the world belongs to Portugal. Vasco da Gama was the first to go down there. The Portuguese have access to this half of the world for trade, but for missionary work as well. This other half of the world belongs to the Spanish for purposes of trade and missionary work and stuff like this. So forget that there were already, 100 million people there or whatever. In terms of European sort of legal structure and religious structure, the world was effectively divided in half for the Spanish and Portuguese. And as we're going to see, this doesn't have the best consequences for the people that actually lived out in those areas or for Europe either. And it was an attempt just to sort of rationalize all of this new information and make sense of what the world looked like. Another weird thing that happened that people didn't really know was going to happen was Africans, in their first interactions with Europeans, saw them as relatively benign. In the Kingdom of Benin, for example, where this painting is from, European rulers and captains showed up, traders showed up, and they seemed weak. They seemed to not have many people. They seemed to not have a bunch of stuff that these West Africans wanted. You look at this painting, like who's in charge, who's in power, right? So Africans didn't expect Europeans to suddenly be more powerful than them. They couldn't see the future. They didn't know that there was going to be these great oceanic adventures, that Europeans were going to get bigger and better guns. They didn't know about the slave trade coming, none of that. In these initial encounters, oftentimes Africans saw themselves in a superior position to the Europeans, or that Europeans were just some new sort of trading power that they were going to have a relationship with, like they did with their other neighbors. They didn't necessarily know what was coming. Likewise, people in the Americas had no idea what was coming. One day, other people just started showing up on boats. People from the Americas didn't know anything about Afro-Eurasia. They didn't know, about this technology. They didn't know about these religions. So they didn't know this stuff was coming either. In all of these early encounters, there's lots and lots of confusion, and there's lots of misunderstandings about the world. And we're going to see that these lead to a lot of sort of clashes between societies based on expectations, based on differing understandings of the world. All right, well, that's going to be it for this time. Next time, we're going to start looking at the changes that are happening in Europe a little bit before all of this exploration stuff, but then after exploration starts, we're going to see a lot of changes in sort of religion, philosophy coming out of Europe that's going to lead us into the modern age. So get on that reading, check out that Traditions and Encounters. Make sure you do your quiz by the end of the week, by Sunday at midnight, get that done. And as always, email me if you have any questions or concerns. Talk to you then.